Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining Two-Way. I'm at the Lancaster Airport in Pennsylvania. I just walked away from the ending of a Trump rally that included a lot of stuff, but it also included two clear but oblique references to Ann Selzer, who's joining us today to talk about her Iowa poll. The president and many of his supporters are no fan of this poll. Let me set the baseline for a few things. Ann is one of the best pollsters in America. Some consider her the best. I've worked with her in the past. Nothing Ann does in her polling is about psyops or partisanship or attempts to influence the debate. And the fact is, President Trump referred to it, a poll came out right before the election. Yeah, polls come out right before the election because that's what people like Ann measure. Ann polls all over the place, but she's best known for her work in Iowa, where she lives. She does the Iowa poll for the Des Moines Registers and others. And Ann has a well-deserved reputation for being able to do great polls. Now, the best pollsters in the world, because the nature of polling, sometimes their polls come out bad. That's just the nature of polling. Not every great pollster gets it right every time. So maybe I will be really close, and Ann will once again be heralded as a magically great pollster with rigorous methodology. Maybe she'll be wrong. Maybe this poll will not be accurate. Ann's polls, like all polls, they're not predictions. They're snapshots in time. This is a snapshot right before the election. But just because a poll ends up being wrong in the sense that it doesn't match the election results, doesn't mean that Ann engaged in psyops or is a bad pollster. Some polls just end up being off. That's the nature of beast. Like 1 in 20 are just off. Now, what we're going to talk about with Ann, who's been generous enough to join us, is what the poll shows, her methodology. Not all pollsters do things the same way. And Ann's type of polling is now distinct from a lot of other polls. Ann and I happen to agree that her methodology is actually the best, but other people differ from that. So we're going to talk to Ann about how she did the poll, what it showed. If you don't know, most of you I'm sure do, this poll has set the world on fire. Why does it matter? Iowa's not a battleground state. Other polls, including one done in the last couple of days, show what most people had assumed, which was President Trump, who won Iowa, I believe, by 8 4 years ago, would win by roughly the same. So why does it matter? It matters because the people on the right who don't like Ann's poll are saying this is part of a psyops. So we need to address that. But it matters because if Ann's result is close to reality, what some people believe is that, well, what does that mean for Wisconsin? What does that mean for some of the groups who are where the vice president's doing very well with an Ann's poll? What does that mean about how they may vote in other states, not just Wisconsin? That may lead to a more favorable result for the vice president than the overall polling suggests. Ann's poll is an outlier in the sense that it shows Kamala Harris doing really well in a red state. We don't have very many of those. There's some. There's some polls that have shown her doing well in Texas, for instance. But this is an outlier in that respect. And the question for people is this on the leading edge of where things are headed at the end of the election? Or is it an outlier? And Ann would be the first to tell you, not all polls turn out to be accurate, even by the best pollsters. So grateful to you for joining, whether you're watching on YouTube or here on Two-Way. If you're going to play in the chat, as always, peace, love, and understanding, the presumption of grace. Even though President Trump did not seem to be extending the presumption to Ann in his speech just now here in Lancaster, you should all extend it to Ann. Ann is, again, one of the best professionals I know that I've worked with in any profession, but she's one of the best pollsters in the country and a very nice person. So we're all going to be very polite to Ann, even in the chat. I'll say again, she's not engaged in a conspiracy. She's not trying to hurt Donald Trump. She's not engaged in psyops. She did the poll at the behest of a client, and she did it with her normal professionalism. So, Ann, welcome in.
Thank you.
Let's show the poll results for those of you who haven't seen it. It shows Vice President Harris up by 3, and Ann's previous poll showed the race closer than most polls, but not with the vice president ahead. So, Ann, your phone exploded and your email inbox exploded more than mine did. But this has been the talk of the political world since last night. Just walk people through how you poll. What's your methodology? Do you use live phone calls? How do you determine who to poll? Just walk through people this in this poll, but in general, how you do it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. This is the same methodology that I have had in place going back before 2008. So it's been tested any number of times. We do live interviews, and we do both a sample of landlines and a sample of cell phones and try to get that balanced out. What we do that is a little different is what I want to do is to be in a position to be out of the way of my data revealing to me what the future electorate looks like. So you'll hear some pollsters saying, well, the only trick is figuring out what the future electorate is going to look like and making those assumptions. I don't assume. So the way that I do that is to get a cross section of all Iowa adults, random digit dialing, both cell phones and landlines. And the first question we ask, among the first, is the determination of whether they qualify as a likely voter. So they either tell us they've already voted. If that isn't likely, I don't know what is. Or they say they will definitely vote. If they say probably vote, that's not strong enough for us. So we only take you if you are yet to vote and it's in the future, or you've already voted. If you don't pass that screen, we still collect some basic demographics. So age and sex, what county you live in, so we can do geography, race, other things, but only a handful of those. Now, we talked to 1,038 Iowans, okay? And we weight that to look like the entire state of Iowa. And within that group, there were 808 who qualified as a likely voter. So we just pull them out. And that way, if you're more likely to vote, if your demographic is more likely to vote, you show up in more plentiful numbers in our sample. And if you're less likely to vote, you show up in less plentiful numbers. So our cross section of likely voters doesn't match the state, and it doesn't match anything. So we don't weight according to who we think is likely to vote. So it's simple in a way, but in some ways it's not what most other pollsters are doing.
Right. So, for instance, let's say, and if you know the real stat, tell me, in 2020, what percentage of the general election electorate was Republican, according to the exit polls? Do you know?
According to the, no, I don't have
Okay.
that.
Let's
Sorry.
say it was 54%. Okay, let's just say. If you did your poll and you got your universal people and it showed that the makeup of the electorate was 54% Democrats, you would just say, well, maybe that's going to be the makeup this time for various reasons. You wouldn't say we got to poll some more Republicans, right?
Right. Right.
Okay.
The thing,
Whereas some other pollsters would, they would say we need to look at the recent makeup of the electorate and poll until we get that according to party
right,
registration, age, gender, everything, right?
right. I call that idea that they need to look at things that have happened before, polling backward.
Right.
So they are counting that the future electorate looks like the past electorate, and I don't make that assumption. I
Okay.
call what
So
I
there's
do
been,
polling
yeah,
forward, that I
right,
keep my dirty fingers off the data, and hopefully the data reveals to me an accurate cross section of the future
right.
electorate.
So let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say you knew that in 2020 the makeup was 54% Republicans, and you got back 75% of the electorate was Democrats. Would you still go forward with the poll, knowing that it couldn't possibly be 75% Democrat?
Well, it's hard to say what I would do in that circumstance because I've never been in that circumstance.
Yeah.
Do we see things in our data from time to time that cause us to dig deeper to see if we have an explanation for it? Absolutely. And did we do that on this poll? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, we want to be satisfied that we understand the data as they are. And it is unthinkable to me that I would go back in and, as I say, put my dirty fingers on the data so that it reflects more Ann Selzer than it does the Iowa electorate.
Right. So you've received and seen, as I have, criticism for the poll. People, it's a question of methodology, including the Trump campaign and a memo from their polling team, including a lot online. Have you read or heard any criticism of your poll that you look at and you say, yeah, that's a valid criticism?
No,
No. Okay.
I've
Let's,
I've
yeah,
I've
go ahead.
had things that just make me laugh. Like I
Okay.
must be getting paid by
Right.
somebody. That this is propaganda. And I go, how would
Right.
that work
Right.
exactly?
So, but leaving aside the conspiracy theories and the ad
Yeah,
hominem attacks,
yeah.
has anybody said a thing about your methodology that's made you say, well, I see their point, or that's a good argument. I don't agree with it, but that's a good argument.
What I say is, even I look at my methodology and say, it's too simple, it can't possibly work.
Right.
Yet it has. So maybe one day it will
Yeah.
not work and I'll blow up and little sprinkles of Selzer will cross the city of Des Moines. But it has worked so successfully for so long. I do understand that people think it can't possibly work. And should I be doing maybe some things with text to web, maybe I do that next time, but we're getting enough of the demographics that we need. Are the weights that we ended up applying were actually quite as kind of astonishingly small. So if we're not having to make much adjustment, it means we're getting a pretty good cross sections of all Iowans. We're not
Right.
having weighting an individual responded up 3, 4, 5 times
Right.
to balance out.
But just to clarify, you just said, as you said a little earlier, that you do some weighting.
Yes.
How does your weighting differ from the weighting that other pollsters do, where they go for what they consider to be the quote unquote correct percentages of representation?
I go for the correct percentages at a statewide level. So we know from the census what the distribution of age is within each congressional district, for example. We know what male-female ratio is supposed to be. Sometimes we don't need to use all of those to get an accurate cross-section of the whole state.
Right.
So what I don't know is how in the world we would weight just likely voters without that. So as I said, we got more than 1,000 people we talked to, make it represent the state. Now we just extract those who meet our likely voter criterion.
Right.
And then we trust in that distribution. And
Right.
do they look different from the last time? Yeah, because the dynamics election to election change.
Right.
And
Okay. We're gonna go to. Sorry. Finish up the thought. I apologize.
well, it just how in the world there's a little bit of gumption maybe, and or that's a nice word for it, of people who say they know better than what their data can show them about what this future electorate looks like.
Right. Okay. Couple more questions for me. Then my colleague Noah is going to bring in questions from you also. If you're here on the two-way platform, you want to get a question, and please raise your hand. So your poll is showing a different kind of result, different than other public polls of Iowa, and again, different in the crosstabs from other polls. It's given that it's a state Donald Trump won by 8 last time. It is an outlier in that respect. How would you explain what would account for that?
So what accounts for that, and we saw this in our September poll very clearly. Our June poll, when Joe Biden was on the ticket, Donald Trump had an 18-point advantage. That dropped to a 4-point advantage. So the margin was narrowed by 14 points. And somebody asked me, well, did Donald Trump lose ground? Is that what you're saying? I go, okay, that's a very interesting question. And I got out my calculator and figured out that, in fact, we had 88 more respondents in our likely voter pool. Those are weighted respondents for the geeks in the crowd. And Donald Trump had 3 more than he had in June. So he didn't lose ground. It's that we had more people who qualified as a likely voter in September, and 85 of those weighted bodies went for Kamala Harris. So that's a pretty dynamic change. The demographics we could see separately of the people who qualified compared to June, women, college educated, younger people, all demographics that were more likely than average to support Kamala Harris. So that's how I explain that. And it's really pretty much the same thing here.
Okay, go ahead and put up the tweet. There were lots of tweets criticizing the methodology, and put up the Ryan tweet. Most of them say the crosstabs of the polling reflect a makeup of the electorate, which is not going to be the makeup of the Iowa electorate. Looking at 22, and 20. Noah, are you able to put that up?
I'd like to know who thought they were looking
We
at the
got it.
crosstabs.
Tabs. I shouldn't say the crosstabs because explain to people why you don't make the crosstabs available.
This goes way back into Des Moines Register history preceding me, that at one point they were requested, I think in the 1984 caucuses, the first time caucuses were ever polled. And so they said, sure, and they shipped it off to a pollster who then wrote an op-ed in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or perhaps the Washington Post saying, this is why the Des Moines Register is so completely wrong. And they decided that if anybody's going to write the next story about the poll, they reserve the right to reveal the data.
Right.
So,
Right. Okay. So Noah, are you able to put up that tweet? Maybe it's up and I can't see it because
It's
I'm on
up.
my. It's up. All right. Ann, are you able to see that?
yes.
Okay. Could you just go through and say what you think about those criticisms?
Well, I'm trying, this is in a format that's a little difficult for me to see. What does this D represent and the R represent?
So they're saying that, and again, he says read through the Seltzer crosstabs.
Yeah.
So right, they're saying that they know that this poll shows, and again, it's they say your sample is got it's more 3% more Democrats than Republican, whereas the electorate last time was
Oh,
8%
I
more
see.
Republican. It says that you have Indies voting Democrat +4, whereas last time they
Yeah.
voted for +7, +4. So
Yeah.
they're saying if you compare what you have with what happened in 20, according to the exit polls, it's way too big a change across all these groups in a uniform way towards pro Harris as opposed to Trump.
Yeah. Well, this is the first time I'm seeing this, and so it's sort of against my nature to think I understand everything that this is saying, and I haven't cross-checked these numbers to know how that actually pans
Yeah.
out. But I'm going to say that it is clear that senior women are an advantage to Kamala Harris in our poll. Kamala Harris wins by more than 2-1, actually, maybe even more than that among senior women. It's a big, big spread. So I don't know. I mean, the truth of it all is I don't go back to the previous exit polls to see how my data align with that
Yeah.
because it doesn't matter. I expect there to be dynamism in how the electorate forms itself from poll to poll, from cycle to cycle.
Right. So what people are skeptical about is they say
Yeah.
the sample you came up with in all these areas just
Yeah.
is too large a shift that's not reflected in other state polling
Yeah.
towards
Okay.
Harris. And so again, you would say that your record suggests that when you do poll with your methodology, you get a good reflection of the electorate. And if these changes occurred, it means these changes occurred from one cycle to another, right?
Yes, I have been looking at seniors all the way through this cycle because they have historically been more likely to vote for the Republican candidate. So I've had my eye on them this whole time. Well, here, so that's a big number, it's saying, for senior women voting for a Democrat, if that's what that means. Um, it, 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 it is showing up in my data. It
Right.
is showing up that that's the biggest margin Kamala Harris has.
Right. So
And especially
yeah,
because seniors didn't necessarily vote for Democrats in the past.
right. So last question is, as a polling expert,
Yeah.
is it legitimate to extrapolate from your poll to say if these groups have shifted as a makeup of the electorate and in their support for the Democrat, that you could say this is a harbinger for what might happen in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, maybe other states, or
Yeah.
is that you wouldn't make that leap?
I understand others want to make that leap. As I've said on your show before, there are differences between Iowa and Wisconsin that are make things about voter turnout, for example, different. How red is Iowa compared to Wisconsin? It's far more red. There's only one statewide officer who is a Democrat, at the statewide level. There's nobody in the Washington delegation who's a Democrat, and both houses of our state house are controlled and by large margins by Republicans. So there's been a lot of work to make that happen, and
But
that
could
work
but
is
couldn't
still in place.
but couldn't we extrapolate from what you just said, arguably, that if Harris is leading in a legitimate poll in a red state like Iowa, she's probably going to win a blue state like Michigan.
I would allow others to make that claim and not refute it. How's
Yeah.
that? But I don't know.
Okay, good. All right. No, okay. And thank you. A great explanation. Again, I'll say Anne is not involved in psyops. She's not involved in a conspiracy. She's not trying to hurt Donald Trump. She's not trying to create momentum. She's simply doing a poll using her normal methodology, which has been very effective and accurate over a long period of time, not as a prediction, but as a snapshot of the electorate close to election day, which matches up with what actually happens much more often than not. Noah, please call on folks, bring them in. You can tell where you are, you're voting for if you want, but you don't need to.
I'm going to call on Speaker Gingrich.
Okay, good. And did you want to say something before Speaker Gingrich jumps
I
in?
just wanted to say I'm also not being paid by anyone other than the Des Moines Register and Mediacom, the sponsors of this poll.
Thank you for saying that. I almost didn't want to insult you by pointing it out, but yes, thank
Right.
you. All right, Mr. Speaker, floor is yours.
Well, let me say, first of all, I have admired Anne's work for a very long time. I think she's a consummate professional. I don't happen to agree with this poll, but I think there can be anomalies, that we can talk about later. You introduced me on your show to Seth Keshel, who focuses on registration patterns. And I was sufficiently perturbed by the Iowa results that I went to him among 7 or 8 other people. And it was fascinating because he essentially thinks that it is extraordinarily improbable, just given patterns that have been building. And of course, you did have an alternative poll that came out about the same time that shows Trump winning, I think, by 10 in Iowa. So, and I checked in with Linda Upmeyer, the former Speaker of the House, and she said they had no indications anywhere in any of their counties of the kind of erosion this would imply. But I think you have to expect this at this point. I mean, the truth is, this is a hard-fought campaign, and I think Keshel's work, if you believe it, in terms of the registration patterns, would imply that we are much closer to a Reagan-Carter result than we are to 2016 or 2020. And we'll have to wait and see when the first votes come in. But if you look at the early voting patterns in virtually every one of the swing states, they're staggering. So I would say Anne's contribution, certainly she is so well respected that everybody who is serious about politics last night got busy calling friends and emailing friends and trying to figure out what the devil's going on. We'll see. It could be a harbinger of a dramatic change, or it could be one of those occasions when that particular snapshot didn't work. I mean, we had when Engler ran for governor against the incumbent the Saturday before the election, one of the Detroit papers had Engler losing by 19, and he won on Tuesday. So you just, if you get the wrong sample at the wrong moment, even if you're extraordinarily competent, it doesn't work. So if I had to bet, my bet is that Trump will carry Iowa by 6 to 10 points. But I have enormous respect for Ann and recognize it at least has me thinking differently.
Yeah. Do you want to ask Ann a question, Mr. Speaker?
No, I would just say that, as you know, there's a lot of argumentation about exactly how the various subgroups work, and I think that's part of what the question is all about. I'm curious, when you saw the numbers, I mean, did you have a sort of temptation to go back and double check?
We always double check. I'm not sure what you mean by it, but we double check, we triple check. And especially if a number is surprising to us, we want to be sure we understand it. And how, whether there's something amiss. It virtually always happens that we're able to substantiate things. So, for example, in our preliminary briefing with the Des Moines Register reporters and editors, the first thing I did was walk them through the history of demographics of likely voters from our polls. So for the last, you know, 6 to 8 polls, so that they could see that things lined up. There weren't surprises. There wasn't a sudden jump in college educated. There wasn't a sudden jump in evangelicals or drop in evangelicals for that matter. That the income breaks, everything looks consistent, normal variation of a point or two. So once you see that your demographics are aligned with what you've had before, it makes, again, it gives you some respite from the anxiety that something might be amiss.
Look,
What's the-
one other question I got,
Yeah,
which
please.
is, in your own mind, how do you parse the difference between the simultaneous release of a poll that shows Trump winning by 10, as you're showing, I think Kamala's winning by 4 in yours? I mean, how do you sort of think through, were they just wrong, or does it mean we actually don't know?
They have a completely different method, and they take things into account in weighting, which is the principal investigator, whoever that might be, deciding that they know better than what the data could show them what that future electorate is going to look like.
Thank you. And thank
thank
you for coming on. I think it's
Thank
very
you.
Thank you,
Good, good to see you again, Mr. Speaker.
helpful.
And what's the biggest demographic shift in your survey from previous? Or you're saying they're all small?
There are none of them that don't sort of counter out. So we weight by age, so our age looks good, except that we have a larger number of 65 and over, because a larger proportion qualified for that. Our married number looks just right, whether you have children in your household. Education, not much. Religion, not much. Roughly the same number, proportion of evangelicals. We had slightly fewer people who live in cities than we've seen before, especially in the September poll. A larger number of people who live in rural areas. Both of those things would suggest our Democratic number should be lower, because cities go
Yeah.
Democrat, rural
Yeah.
areas go Republican. So it's a reverse
Yeah.
indicator there. Income lines up almost perfectly without any variation, and we don't touch income.
Right. Okay. Noah, call on someone else, please.
About Sue Smith O'Brien.
Hi, am I unmuted? No.
You are.
Yes, you
Okay.
are.
I was looking at the article in the Des Moines Register. Older voters 65 and older. I am in that age group, and I think people need to realize that as you go back to 2020 and 2016 and beyond, the makeup, the character, the experience of the 65 and older voter has changed dramatically. My generation, we walked out of our high schools for a moratorium against the war. We marched for civil rights. We marched for women's rights. We grew up, we saw what happened in '68. We lived through Nixon and Watergate, and we lived through, all kinds of the assassinations. As a first grader, I was crouching in a hallway during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The senior voter now, I get that there's a lot of very traditional seniors out there, but there's also a lot of people like myself who we have a completely different experience than, let's say, my parents or older aunts or uncles. So I think, Anne, your poll is picking up a shift in a lot of older women, myself included, that are looking at rights we used to have that we may not have. We're looking at our daughters or our granddaughters. And so I'm not surprised that you're showing that women 65 and older are breaking for Harris. I think that's logical given, your experiences in life. So I appreciate what you do and appreciate the poll.
Thank you.
So that was just my comment.
I think you're making a really important point here, which is that the age cohorts aren't static. they march up the age scale. And this is the first election after the end of COVID, and we lost, I hate to be morbid, but
Right.
we lost some of that cohort. So I appreciate your comment that the people who are newly entered into the 65 and older category bring with them life experiences that are different from the people at the very top end of
Right.
that
I mean,
cohort.
20 years ago, it was a completely different makeup because they lived through different things. And so my experiences and what I was involved in, and I saw in the campus protest in Kent State, I mean, there was a huge shift for not everyone, but a lot of women. We were the generation that broke barriers in business and in law schools, in medical schools. You know, how many women were on a trading floor when I was on the trading floor? Not very many. So we just have a different experience. We're not all the stay-at-home mom that my mother was, or other people. We have been out in the workforce, and a lot of what we hear just rubs us the wrong way. So again, I'm not surprised. My personal experiences, my friendships tell me that this is the way. I don't know many older women. I hate saying I'm old, but that aren't in line with what you're saying. I think more are that way. So thank you.
Thank you.
No, I'll call on someone else, please.
How about Mel Hogg? Can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we're good.
Hello, from Colorado, Trump voter, but I just want to know, and it's not a pointed question like that, but the results of the poll were on Twitter ahead of time. Is that normal for polls to get disseminated across campaigns or people ahead of time? And is that how that occurred?
When you say ahead of time, what time are you talking about?
It was probably midday afternoon yesterday.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
And I keep seeing references to the notion that the governor of Illinois had the results before they were published.
So someone tweeted saying that there was a poll, the poll was going to be +3 Harris. And then they asked, how do you know? Is it Governor Pritzker said in a Duke meeting or something? That's what it was.
Yeah, I've seen reference that. I've been trying to run it down. Ann, do you know anything about that?
I know nothing about it. I know that at the end of the briefing on Friday, there's a pledge that pretty much gets taken, even keeping the results private to only that group of reporters and editors working on it, to not
Right.
have any paper of any kind that has the results on it inside the Register newsroom. So
Right.
I don't.
So let me say
don't-
something about. Sorry. Go ahead. I apologize.
Maybe you can enlighten me.
So this is not about Ann. Ann is not saying what I'm saying, and this is not about what happened in this case. But let me be straight about what happens with news making polls. Often, people in the journalism business, and I've done this in my career, will have access to polling data that they will give to their best sources and say, "Don't tell anyone, but you should know that this poll's coming out," because they get a barter goodwill with their sources. And so people in news organizations do it all the time. And there's my favorite expression: I'm good at keeping secrets, but the people I tell are not. So is it possible that someone from the Register, I'm just doing this as a hypothetical, they said, well, Governor Pritzker's a great source of mine, or Governor Pritzker's top political operative, so I'm going to tell that person, hey, don't tell anyone, but this poll's coming out. Even if that happened in this case, people should stop making a big deal of it. It doesn't affect the data. It doesn't change the result. And now, could it be that Governor Pritzker could then call Wilmington and say, hey, this poll's coming out. Let's start drafting a press release that says shows momentum? Sure. There's some incremental advantage, but reporters share polls with Republicans and Democrats. And the incremental advantage there is meaningless, and it doesn't speak to the data one bit. So I know people want to say that part of the conspiracy that goes around this whole notion that this whole thing was like a conspiracy of Ann to try to impact the race, which again is absolutely baseless. But as I'll say, Even if someone shared the data early, it has no impact on anything. It's an interesting fact of how reporters use valuable polling data, but it has nothing to do with the validity of the data or the methodology or Ann's motivation, etc.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Noah.
John Podorets.
John loves polling.
I love polling. It's Podhoretz. And hi, it's an honor to talk to you. Quickly, this has nothing to do, it's nothing to do with your poll, but Nate Cohn mentions in his summary of the New York Times poll that they register a 16% non-response. I don't know how he has determined this, but a 16% non-response from white Republicans as against white Democrats.
That white Republicans are 16 percentage points less likely to participate
answer.
in the polling
Right.
than white Democrats, which, if true, to my immature mind, would invalidate their entire poll. But keep going, John.
Okay, but again, so you still have a sub, it's not all white people, it's white Republicans. And so, right, if true, if this is his anxiety, how do you correct? I know you don't like to correct, so or wait. So, but how do you have this mammoth, unprecedented number of over 65 women going in this direction, and that would seem one possible response to that is, and you kind of alluded to this, that you weren't getting the same response, that you might not have simply gotten the responses from white women over 65 who would have gone against Harris for some reason, and that therefore they're just not featured in your poll. And then the final point is, your margin of error seems very high for a poll of this size in a small state, right? You have 800 respondents. The margin of error is 6 or 6.6. Am I missing something?
You are referring, I think, to the margin of error for the congressional districts.
Oh, I'm sorry.
For the
Okay.
808, it's plus or minus 3.4
Okay,
percentage
fine.
points.
Okay. So that okay. So anyway,
So
that's my
forget the second question. Thank you for
yes.
clarifying. And what do you have to say about that first question? This is besides your poll. This is kind of the other big polling question of the day that people like John and I had. So are you able to address that at all?
Well, what I can say is that in terms of incidents among the age 65 and over, for example, men versus women is roughly the same. So 92% of the men age 65 and over that we talked to said they had already voted or intended to vote. It's 94% among women. So that's a little bit of an answer there. But the other side, I mean, Marcus said it, and I'll reiterate it. We don't know. And I don't know how Nate Cohn, I have great respect for Nate Cohn.
Right.
I don't know, although he's got one of the most complicated likely voter models or methodologies that are out there. So I don't know.
Okay,
But
John.
just last point here would be, when you see a shift as dramatic as you have seen, obviously it's an entirely different poll to have Trump over Biden by 17. You have a different candidate after Biden. So these are not entirely comparable, although we live in a very partisan gravity world in which you would not have tended to think that the shift would be that extraordinarily dramatic, down from 17 to 4 or whatever it was. But I am right to think that if Wednesday morning we wake up to discover that your poll got it right or pretty close to right or something like that, that this is an epical political moment. This is a massive and unpredicted change, particularly in your state, which, as Mark said, no one had on their has on their cheat sheet that it's a swing state. So this poll now is a stand-in kind of for a whole question about whether or not and I guess the first questioner kind of brought this up, whether something has happened, maybe it's abortion, maybe it's Trump plus abortion or whatever, that is leading us into a new political era, like instantly. Would that be a fair evaluation of
Well,
your
the one hypothesis, and I don't have, I prefer to have data driven answers to things, but what we kicked around with the reporters and editors is the June poll, what happened that had Trump leading by 18 points. It was after that the Iowa law on a 6-week ban on abortion took place. I mean, that it's now in place. So one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country, and that people have had now a few months of seeing what the consequences are for that. We don't have anything on the ballot to test that directly. So it is quite literally a hypothesis. But you see the strong lead with women. So Linda Lake said on the show, you want to win with women by more than you lose with men. And that shows up in our data, that it's an independent swing, that they had been for Trump in the last 2 elections. They're now firmly in the Harris front. So people who aren't guided as much or locked into a particular ideology are responding there as well. But I'm as eager as anybody else to see what happens on Tuesday.
Yeah. Part of why people are surprised by that result is that states don't typically swing dramatically in one cycle. Going from a plus Trump 8 state to even a plus Harris 1 state would be a surprise because it'd be a 9-point swing in one cycle. But we do have the issue of reproductive freedom that we know a political earthquake, and we know that Iowans, for instance, were on the leading edge of changing their point of view on gay marriage. Supreme Court ruled on it, had all sorts of reasons why that happened. But my point is, I'm not prepared to say I don't believe that Trump will lose Iowa, but I'm not prepared to say that there couldn't be a seismic swing that would be bigger in Iowa than it might be in some of these other states.
Yeah.
The other thing to consider is that the laboratory test of 7 states getting tens of millions of dollars in advertising, okay, and then the other states being sort of left on their own organically to do what they do, so that you're not seeing in Iowa ads against Kamala Harris on trans issues.
Right.
You're not seeing Kamala Harris beat up routinely every day by surrogates, etc. So it could be that state, which used to be a blue state and was a purple state, it could be that state, left to its own devices, has abortion rights being a bigger issue in how women are thinking about voting than in other states where they're more cross-pressured on issues like trans and trying to demonize Kamala Harris.
It could be. And I guess I'm reminded of the 2008 presidential election. We were polling in Michigan and Indiana in addition to Iowa. Our final Indiana poll, keep in mind that in 2004, George Bush won Indiana by 19 points. Our final poll had Obama up less than 1%, but up. So I think it was, and I don't have it in front of me, maybe it was 0.6, Obama up in Indiana. And, there was some freaking out going on then because it was hard to imagine that was true. And the final result came in at 0.9. And I'm the proudest of that. I was proud that my client, the Indianapolis Star, had no problems with running it and that we were so precisely accurate. It could have been, more percentage points off, and that I'd still feel proud about that. But that's a swing. So it's not true that we never see swings. And I agree that the Obama period of time was different in many states, but to have that big a swing in Indiana, which is associated as being a pretty red state, it happens.
Yep, absolutely. Next question, Noah. John, thank you. Noah.
How about Tanya Watson?
Hi.
Welcome in. Floor is yours.
I'm excited you brought up Indiana. I'm actually was raised there, remember when it went red for Obama. I live in Michigan now. So I was, I actually was going to ask you answer my question actually before I came in, which was how we look at Iowa in comparison to like in Indiana. Do we think that we would see this type of shift across the country? Is that kind of what your approach is telling us?
I would love to be in a position that I had my own data in Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I don't. And as I said, I'm kind of a methodology archaeologist. I go digging to see how these various things are conducted. I'm not a fan of panels, which when they poll the same people over and over and over, because you can get an instrument effect. That is, the fact that you're going to be polled changes the way you consume media, changes the conversations you might be having. So it's, people say my method is old fashioned, and I wouldn't disagree with that. The ways in which people have adjusted their methodology largely have to do with the cost, because my method is expensive to do it the way we do it. But I appreciate your question. And I think you need a pundit, which I am not, to tell you what this means for other states.
Yeah. I will say again, part of why Ann does such great work is she does do it the old fashioned way. And she just said it is more expensive. So if you're looking for a non-partisan, non-hysterical reason to say, why might Ann's poll, although different than the other Iowa poll that was cited, and the general direction of polls in other states, why that might be different, you'd say maybe Ann's tried and true methodology is better and more accurate, and that the reason other people don't do it is in part because they like newfangled things and they think landlines are too anachronistic, but in part because, as I've said here many times, a lot of public polls are done on the cheap, and if you do them on the cheap, you're going to be less likely to get good results than if you do it hands down. On balance, overall, doesn't mean every one of Ann's polls is going to hit, because as I said at the top, even the best pollsters, the science will tell you 1 in 20 polls or so is going to be off. Noah, next person, please.
How about Jim Bonnier?
Well, now we have a certifiable expert here, I believe.
Yep.
Jim Bognet here. And thanks for coming on so we can ask you some questions. I guess my only big picture thought is, Mark, you've covered campaigns and I've sat inside presidential campaigns. If the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign saw the race going in this direction, and even if Ann's, poll was a thunderclap, we would see some immense changes today. We would see millions of dollars of text messages go out. Radio would be bought tomorrow morning in Iowa. They would start playing hard here. I don't think we're going to see that. So I guess my question for Mark and Ann is, why aren't we seeing that? And then my second question for Ann is, Ann, you talk about predicting the future electorate. Do you not take into account any of the registration changes that we've talked about on Mark's platform before? Does the 6-point swing to Republicans in Iowa enter your methodology at all?
It does not enter my methodology. In Iowa, we have same-day registration. So you can show up to vote, and if you're not registered, you can register that day. So we random digit dial the entire state of Iowa, whether you're registered or not. And we would not wait on party registration because there's cross voting. It's certainly possible, and we can't predict how much or how little that might be.
Jim, the answer to your other question is the Trump campaign certainly doesn't think that's where Iowa is. And the Harris campaign doesn't either. It's also 2 days before the election.
Too late.
They're not gonna take a risk on diverting resources away from the 7 states to a state which they don't need to win, and where the chances of winning they believe are lower than the others. So if Ann's, I'll tell you this, if Ann's had gotten that result a month ago, I think the Democrats would have gone in and done their own research and evaluated whether it made sense to expand the map that way. But there's just not the time to do it now without a recalibration that could really be dangerous, because they have limited bandwidth, and even though they're a very well funded campaign, they've allocated every dollar for these 7 states.
And if I'm recalling it right, I think Nate Silver's write-up later last night was that it wouldn't change the electoral map, that it wouldn't be enough to change things. I haven't done that kind of analysis, but he's thinking it's
Yeah.
moot.
Yes. Well, it's not totally moot because I believe if there's a combination of Nevada, Iowa, and one red state that would do it, well, they wouldn't need it then. It's actually that could be true. It's not clearly dispositive in the most likely combinations where she falls just short. I have to go look at that a little closer if I have all the time in the world. All right, Noah, let's take another one question if we could.
Oh, how about Diane Moreland?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I was just I had a question for Anne about if she had any information about like women of reproductive age in her polling, if they've changed at all, or
The one thing I can tell you is that the one age cohort, age 35 to 54, Trump leads with that group.
and what about like women less than the and like in the lower like maybe 20 to 35, like more reproductive age women? Where do
Right.
they lean towards?
That cell size starts to get too small. I don't have it
Okay.
right here in front of me if I were to try to run it, but we'd be cautious about it.
Interesting. I was
Okay.
just curious because a lot of people seem to be associating this change in your poll with the abortion law, but it seems like people who are always talking on two-way about reproductive rights, just they don't tend to be women of reproductive age. They tend to be older women or men with daughters, and I just in my age group don't hear a lot of people. I'm in Lynn County, Iowa, by the way. I just don't hear a lot of outreach about that law,
Yeah, it's
except
interesting.
on the news,
Right.
national news. So
Right. Thank you for the
thanks,
question.
Ann.
Anne, is there anything else you want to say before we close? I got a couple points I want to make, but is there anything you want to say?
I mentioned just very briefly the congressional district race, which that story came out this morning. The first district shows a strong lead for the Democrat there, 53 to 37. Third district, which includes the Des Moines area, 48-41 for the Democrat. The others are tilting Republican, but people have said, wow, how is this happening? And I tend to think, I speculate that this may be something that is happening more from the ground up rather than because the presidential presence here is minimal. So
Right.
that the organization in those two congressional districts may be boosting what's happening at the presidential
Right.
level.
Great point. And we're so grateful to you for making time. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you. And if some other stuff comes up and you want to weigh in, come back tomorrow morning meeting or 2-way tonight or shoot me an email. But we're really grateful to you. And it's testament, I would say, to how respected you are that your poll in the sea of millions of other polls that have come out in the last week, your poll has had such a big impact and it inspired Democrats and infuriated Republicans. But that's not, again, the reason they
And
did
both
the poll.
could lead to changes in their behavior. Could
Correct.
motivate
Correct.
them to turn out.
Correct. And thank you. I'm bad at math, and I'm in the airport here, so I don't have my computer app. But I think it's the case that if Trump won New Hampshire, but Harris won Iowa, and she won all the Sunbelt states, and she won all the blue wall states, that she would win. In other words, that Iowa could offset a loss in New Hampshire. It wouldn't offset a loss in Minnesota. I think it would also offset a loss in New Mexico. Wouldn't offset a loss in Virginia. So in half of the 4 blue states that Trump probably won't win, Iowa could play a role there potentially. Here's what I want to say, besides, again, thanking Ann and Speaker Gingrich and John and everyone else who has questions. What has disheartened me about this is Ann's poll, as we said, baby right may not be, but the conspiracy mongering, the personal attacks on Ann, the assumption that there's something corrupt here and partisan and something for people to be infuriated about is not a great harbinger for the next 2 days and maybe, unfortunately, 2 weeks or 2 months if we have an overtime election. So I just urge everybody who's part of this community just to think about, not for yourself, but also to the extent you go on social media, try to tamp it down. This is not just like this is. I would equate this to a problem with casting and counting, a legal suit, long lines, a clerk making a mistake, right? Those things are going to be, unfortunately, the subject to personal attacks, invective, threats, all the things that happen right now in this hothouse of an environment. Ann's poll may be right or it may not be, but to turn Ann's poll into a conspiracy or a claim of partisanship or a reason to engage in questioning Ann's competence or professionalism is not just ridiculous, but it's dangerous as a part of the dynamics we're all familiar with, where not just on social media, but in text chains and on cable TV, we all have to fight against that until we have a winner, and to not let the conspiracy theorists win, because 99+% of us, not just members of this community, but of the country, that's not the way they think about the world. It's not their orientation. But the 1% or so who have that orientation are the loudest and angriest voices on the national town square. And this applies to the left and the right. And we all have to work together to try to keep that from dominating, because there will be clerical errors in the Castamine County. There will be long lines. There will be controversies over early vote counting versus same day counting. All that's going to happen. And this was a bad test run to allow President Trump and many of his supporters to turn this not into, let's rationally discuss the methodology, which is what the Trump campaign did in their memo, but on social media, and President Trump himself turned it into, Ann's their enemy, Ann's a partisan, this is a conspiracy, this was done to affect the race. We can't have that. If we have that, almost no matter what, the result is going to be questioned by the losing side, because there's always, in our messy elections that are down at the local level, there's always going to be things that the conspiracy theorists can look at. So please don't do that. I urge you. And again, not only to not do it yourself, but to call it out, as we tried to do here, to call it out when people do it. Doesn't mean you can't be critical. Doesn't mean you can't question. You should, but it should extend to science and math and law and specifics, as opposed to things that are just made up. Very grateful to you all for making time on a Sunday. If I can get my flight, I'm going to go to see JD Vance speak in the Philadelphia area. And I will see you at 9 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow with Sean and Marathon Running Dan right here on Two-Way, and then tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Thank you all. Have a great day.